It's early 2022. We're seeing a lot of new phones pop up, and a lot of them are running the new Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, their new flagship chip. Now, the first time I had access to it was in January, and I was sent a couple Realme devices as well as the Moto X30 that used this chip, and when I ran my initial benchmarks on it, it did not look good. The chip was able to perform better than the 888 from last year, and was pretty competitive with Apple's iPhones, but it needed a ridiculous amount of energy to achieve those scores. And it produced a lot of heat to the point where some of these devices couldn't even finish the benchmarks. They would overheat and would shut down. So the thing is, I didn't make any video at the time because I just chalked it up to like speed, right? These companies were trying to put out a device as soon as possible to be the first on the market with this kind of chip in it. And I felt like they just weren't done well. But recently I picked up this device. This is the OnePlus 10 Pro. And say what you will about OnePlus as a company in terms of their elevated pricing and the kind of sketchy direction of the brand, but the one thing they've always done well is they make a phone with great performance. They've always tuned the device to work nicely with the chip. It's properly cooled. They've always done a great job with it, and they have software features to maximize the performance of the device. So when I picked this up, I assumed that this would be a really good representation of what this new Snapdragon chip could do, right? So I ran the benchmarks, but it had the same kind of performance. It's better, but energy efficiency still wasn't where I was hoping it to be. And because it pulls so much juice, it gets hot. And in some cases, it throttles really aggressively to deal with that heat. Like in Genshin, this will last maybe 6-7 minutes before it throttles down. Now, almost all phones are gonna choke on Genshin, even the iPhones. But when this new chip gets too hot, the performance is barely better than last year's 888, and that's the biggest problem with all that heat. It can only flex for a few minutes before it becomes no better than the old chip. So as a reviewer, you look at this data and the first reaction you have is like, this isn't a good chip, right? That's the conclusion you draw. You're drawing number one, it draws a lot of juice. Two, if it's drawing this much power to be able to achieve these types of scores, the battery life is invariably going to be shorter, right? But then I started playing Pokemon Unite on this phone, and this is a game I'm very familiar with. I've logged in over 1,200 matches on this thing, and each round is exactly 10 minutes. There's no overtime. It's like a MOBA where you control Pokemon and you do things, but the game is surprisingly consistent in terms of like play time. And every time I've played that on my iPhone 13 Pro Max, I lose about 4 to 5% battery life every match. It's like clockwork. If you have 15% battery life, you'll get in 3 matches. No less, no more, because it's just exactly 10 minutes a game. And when I started playing it on this phone, I was getting very good battery life. And I thought, how is this possible? I was also losing about 4% battery life, 5% battery life per match. And just to put this into perspective, on the Pixel 6 Pro and on the OnePlus 9 Pro, these probably lose around 7% per match. Like, this is so nerdy. Like, how do I know this? Because I've played so many hours of this stupid game. I just know the battery consumption on each round. And I was like, this doesn't make sense. If this is such an energy consumptive chip, how is it lasting just as long as the iPhone 13? And then I realized all of the testing that I've been doing, like all the synthetic benchmarks and the gaming benchmarks, they're all done with extremely demanding scenarios, and those are not realistic representations. They're actually very poor representations of real-world use, right? People aren't buying phones just to benchmark them to get the highest score. Like, most phone use is light to moderate use, and even with games, very few games are nearly as demanding as Genshin Impact, which is why so many reviewers use it. Like, it's a good tool to showcase the upper end of what a chip can do. But I realized that it's actually a really poor way to test this new chip. I take that back. It's not that it's a poor way, but it's not the only way that we should be judging this chip. Because when you run normal tasks on it, like light to moderate use, like you're using YouTube or browsing the net or playing a light game or even a moderately demanding game, this chip is great. It is significantly more energy efficient than the previous generation. And I think that's where it excels. With regular use, this new Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 is great. But I have to return this conversation back to the original stuff, the highly demanding, kind of energy intensive scenarios. And that's where this chip falls apart. It lags behind what Apple has and even some of the older Snapdragon chips in terms of energy efficiency at the top end. I also think the marketing material was a little bit misleading because in order to get those kind of performance bumps, you need to feed it a ton of wattage, and that's where it just eats dirt on energy efficiency. Now, I think that the reason why this is all happening is I think Qualcomm wanted their new chip to be competitive in terms of just raw performance with Apple stuff. I think they wanted their numbers to meet up close in the benchmark world, and they just did whatever they could do to get those numbers up there. Now, there are a couple things that come to my mind though. So number one, I do think that this is something that could be fixed with software, maybe. Like, it seems unlikely, but it's not impossible. But the other thing is that these devices, these are just like regular, like thin, elegant devices, right? I think this chip, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, if you put it in something like the ROG phone or like the Lenovo phones, like the gaming phones, you could probably do some really cool stuff in a more aggressively cooled device. But my overall thoughts on the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 and the upcoming phones this year, I gotta be honest, in January, I was concerned. When I first saw the benchmarks and I was running the meters to look at the consumption, I was like, man, these things are they're gonna be hot. But having seen this from the perspective of real use, right? You don't just tunnel vision on benchmarks and Genshin Impact, and you actually use it for real things, it's actually a great chip. Okay, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thumbs if you liked it, subs if you loved it. I'll see you guys next time.